Welcome back to Module 10 of ED 621C. By now you've finished your GRASPs format for your culminating performance tasks for your UBD unit, for your backwards design unit. And now in this module you're going to be creating rubrics for those culminating performance tasks. Some of you may have already created a rubric for another part of your lesson, and that's fine to include it in your UBD lesson. What we're looking for now is specifically rubrics for the culminating performance task. So in this module, our objectives are that you design comprehensive rubrics that are clearly aligned with and based on the success criteria of the culminating performance tasks of your UBD unit, of your backwards design unit, and to create comprehensive rubrics that are student-friendly, same rubrics, and designed to motivate students through the feedback they offer. So rubrics are designed not only to evaluate but to motivate, and you'll see why when we look at our PowerPoint. So your tasks for this module are to read, watch, review, and apply the resources in the module. Read, review, classroom assessment, chapter 5. Once again, it's something that's familiar to you already, I hope. Design 2 comprehensive rubrics. This is what you're going to do. One for each of the culminating performance tasks in your backwards design unit based on each CPT guideline for success. So each one is going to have a different criteria for success, obviously. These rubrics should meet the standards for effective rubric design. They should be authentic and student-friendly, usable and comprehensible, and aligned with the appropriate standards, goals, and objectives. Students submit rubrics to the Dropbox review and feedback by the due date. So now let's look at Module 10 and see what we've got in store for you. So you'll have the screencast here. Here is the PowerPoint for the screencast. Here are some guiding questions that you want to absolutely take a look at and think about when you're designing your rubrics. Does the rubric relate to the outcome being measured? Does it cover important criteria for student performance? What is important, right? We're always talking about what is important for students to learn. What is it important for them to show us they've learned? Does the top end of the rubric reflect excellence? Are the criteria and scales well defined? We're going to talk a little more about this in the PowerPoint, so I'm not spending a lot of time on these here. And can the rubric be applied consistently by different scores? This is very important, and it's actually part of the rubric that you are assigned to. And the question is, can I take your rubric and sit down with that student and evaluate them without you being around? Would I understand it as a substitute teacher, or I myself as a teacher understand your rubric and be able to use it with your students? That's the big question. Can other people use your rubrics besides you? Then we have example of a 6 traits rubric. And what I wanted to point out about the 6 trait rubric is that there are 6 traits. And so these are the domains, and you'll see we're talking about domains in the PowerPoint. But the domain of ideas and content, there's one rubric. There's one set of rubrics for it, from absolutely not beginner to experienced writer. And you can see that the way they've described each domain, the level of interval changes with each level of ability. Meaning maker is probably the benchmark. Everybody wants to meet the benchmark, and that's what's nice about this. It notes the benchmark. So you have another domain conventions, domain voice, domain organization, domain word choice, and domain sentence fluency. They use the same descriptors for the intervals, which keeps students from being confused, and it doesn't give a lot of detail. It gives enough so that you know what needs to be to show success at that level. The math rubric, you can look at a math rubric. There's an oral presentation rubric here. It is scanned, but once you pull it up, once you download it, it looks better. And now we're looking at the actual rubric template that you'll be using. And you'll see that this is very, very bare, but you'll be putting the student task right here. You'll be bulleting, bullet, the criteria to be met, the success criteria. The title of the rubric, please include the title of the rubric, please include your name. Don't worry about score or student name. This is as if you were going to be using it yourself. You'll have your interval level, from low to high or from high to low. Some people are left to right, some people are right to left, but just make sure whatever you do, you explain it to your students. And then your domains here, or you can have a domain, like the 6 traits. There's a lot of different ways to organize it, and it can all be clear, and you just need to remember to explain it to the students. Let me show you the Chowdown version of my model. I'm not going to download it, but you can see I have actually put the name here, not once but twice. The prompt is the actual piece that I'm going to put into my lesson plan, my lesson learning opportunities. The task overview is what's going to go onto your UBD unit underneath culminating performance tasks. You've already done that. Sorry, you've already done that. So here's the task overview. This is the student version of it. Here's your bullet with the criteria to be met, and it should match what you had on your grasps. If you need to readjust your grasps, that's fine. Readjust them. If you find that your success criteria wasn't as clear as it might have been, you wanted to add something, you wanted to change something. If you do change the success criteria, please put it in red so that I know you've actually made that change so I can pay attention to that. Then here's the title, balance menu for a 3-day outdoor ed center trip. My name, don't worry about score, and then you have your interval levels. These meals will be great, these meals will be a little confusing, not ready to eat these meals, where's the beef? So that was a pun. You might feel like getting a little funny on yours, and actually humor is good, but be careful about the kind of humor you use. If the humor is somewhat demeaning, don't use it. If humor is just a little bit funny, it's a play on words, go ahead. But there's a fine line, and I may call you on it from my perspective. And then, of course, you've got your domains here, food groups, number of daily portions, 9 meals, letter to the supervisor, and grammar and conventions. And you'll see all of those are here or embedded together. So all of these will be seen in the rubric itself. And then here's your Dropbox for the rubrics, and you can look at this model too if you want. Basically, you just need to make sure you have the prompt, the student version, the criteria to be met, and that the criteria to be met is in. And you can see that each domain has just one line. You're not killing them with details. So let's take a look at the PowerPoint about creating rubrics. Why are rubrics useful? They provide authentic assessment based directly on learning targets. So they tend to reduce teacher-to-teacher variations in grading. That's the whole reliability piece, like I said before. If you can hand it to me and I can use it with your student without asking you any questions, then the reliability is very high. And that's what you're aiming for. They provide both a quantitative and qualitative measure of students' success and growth, so don't use just number intervals, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. They help a teacher assess student products more objectively and fairly on a set of uniform criteria, again reliability and validity. And they provide students clarity about the criteria upon which they will be assessed, so the students actually know what they're looking for. So when you look for your rubrics and your Dropboxes, you are doing exactly the same thing your students will do. They want to know where they're going and what they need to have that will show success in terms of what you are asking them to do. It's a criterion-based scoring guide, so it's based on the criteria of your unit, of the material that you've taught, and of the culminating performance task specifically. There's a fixed measurement scale. 3 to 6 points is usually a good range. You don't really want to have really wide, huge ranges. Sometimes we go up to 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, but that's still only 5 interval scales, but you have a little bit of variability in between each level. Descriptions of the characteristics for each score point, describes degrees of quality, proficiency, and/or understanding along a continuum versus a checklist or rating scale. So we're not making checklists or rating scales. And you'll see in Module 11 we're actually using a checklist. A checklist. So the rubric that assesses increasing control of the 6 facets of understanding is designed as a continuum. And actually we're going to refer to that at the end of this PowerPoint. A rubric answers the questions: by what criteria should performance be judged and discriminated? Where should we look? And what should we look for to judge performance success? How should the different levels of quality, proficiency, or understanding be described and distinguished from one another? So you're just helping sort it out, like sorting out beans. Types of rubrics. There's a holistic rubric, which gives you an overall impression of students' work and yields a single score or rating of a product or performance. What we're looking for is the analytic rubric. It divides a product or performance into distinct traits or dimensions and judges each separately. A distinct score is provided for each trait dimension. For example, the 6 traits of writing that we looked at. That's an interval scale. For assessing understanding, an analytic rubric is preferable because it provides a much higher quality of feedback that provides specific information to students and parents so that everybody can understand it and they know what they're being graded on. So we'll start with 10 tips, and then we actually have 5 more to go, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. I want you to read them on your own, please. They are in the PowerPoint. Don't make task-specific rubrics, but I just want to say I'll give a little bit of information on each one. Don't craft a rubric based on single elements of the assignment or project. You just don't have time for that. It takes a lot of work and thought. You want to make a good rubric. You want to make it general. You want to have enough detail to show differences in intervals, but you also want to be able to use it in different assignments. You really want to be able to do that as well. Don't be excessively general is the other side of that same coin. Don't be too detailed. It'll kill everybody. And the kids won't understand it. I won't understand it. You probably understand it because you built it, but that's not necessarily a high quality rubric. But give enough information so another person can use rubric for scoring without having to guess what the criteria mean, and that's the reliability. So don't put things in it like good punctuation. That's not going to be a scoreable piece. You need to be much more specific than that. If you want some piece of grammar to be in it that shows excellence in the use of that particular skill, you need to say what that skill is going to be in the rubric. And you might go back and look at the 6 traits writing rubric to check that out. And it has bullets. So keep it to 1 page, no smaller than 12-point font. You probably won't need to do more than that. Focus on a limited number of dimensions, so try not to have more than 4 or 5. You want to focus, where do you want the students to look? Where do you want the person to look that's evaluating the students? Where do you want to look for success in performance? Use key, teachable, and measurable criteria just like your objectives. This is an assessment, so think SMART, S-M-A-R-T, SMART. Use measurable criteria. Why is that duplicated? Select descriptors carefully and keep them objective. One of the things, like you saw mine, the one said, "Where's the beef?" And that's kind of a pun. It's like, we're missing a meal here. But poor, fair, good, excellent, minimal, these words are editorial words. They have no academic value. And they're qualitative or quantitative. They just don't have a value. You don't know what those words mean. To you, it means one thing. To me, it means something else. So you need specific language on your descriptors to indicate what is acceptable performance, what is not acceptable performance. Aim for 4 or 5 levels. You don't really need more than that. Once in a while you can get away with 3, especially with the little guys. But it's always important to explain the rubric and the use of it to the students before you use it, and this will defer a lot of confusion. Keep the distance between the levels equal. So there really needs to be a distinction between a 1 and a 2, a 2 and a 3, and a 3 and a 4. But it shouldn't be so wide that you can't actually make a 4 because you've already put the 4 in the 3. I don't know if that makes sense or not. Anyway, take a look at examples of the rubrics we have, and then you might find some other examples. If you have any questions about, well, I will give you feedback in any case on the rubrics, but if you have any questions about these level distinctions, let me know. Send me an email. The best way to get student buy-in is to have them help you create the rubric. The thing about that is you have to watch out for the language they want you to use. kids, they get glib, especially middle schoolers and upper elementary. They like playing with words, and they have a kind of an earthy sense of humor, which you have to kind of help them sidestep, because it can be actually a little bit too emotionally laden, and you want to make sure that the language is professional. But the reason you want them to help in creating or adapting a rubric is because they'll have a head start in understanding what your expectations are. They'll know what the target is. They'll buy into the work, and they'll strive to do their best. And their good ideas will probably add to the rubric. You'll be surprised at what you can learn from students. So here's the 5 more. Use parallel language. More tips for sound rubrics. Use parallel language. Make sure the language from column to column is similar, that the syntax and wording correspond. This I will also be very cognizant of when you submit these to me, to see that these are equivalent. The parallel language is equivalent. The words may change, as will the expectations, but the readability, you make sure that the rubric can be consistent and read from left to right or right to left. Use student-friendly language. If the students can't understand the rubric, then how do you expect it to guide instruction, reflection, or assessment? You want the students to engage in using the rubric. They have to understand it. So the language needs to be learning level appropriate. So kindergarten rubrics need to have kindergarten language. 3rd grade rubrics need to have 3rd grade language. 12th grade rubrics need to have 12th grade language. If you use academic language or concepts, then you need you'll take time to teach the students those meaning and concepts. Use the rubric with your students. Show them how they work. Show them what the levels are. Let them ask questions. This is called deconstructing the rubric. You want to deconstruct the rubric with the students, or unpack the rubric is another way to say that. You unpack the rubric with your students before you have them use it. That's only fair. They need to know where they're aiming and what they're aiming for, and they can actually ask questions for clarification that might help you. You can also use the rubrics after they're done for your parent-teacher conferences or student-led conferences. They're outstanding pieces of data. And if students and stakeholders use the rubric, they'll understand these expectations and their relevancy to learning. Don't use too many columns. Aim from 4 to 5 columns. That's usually sufficient. 4 columns is usually pretty comfortable. 5 columns is okay. Rely on descriptive language. That means avoiding words like good and excellent. We just talked about that. But do not rely on numbers. I don't want to say they have 5 spelling words right, they have 10 spelling words right, they have 20 spelling words right. If spelling is really important, that can be a domain and you can do that. But the whole document should not be based on quantifiable information. It should be qualitative as well as quantitative. So this descriptive, where it says, what's the difference between using Wikipedia or an original article, isn't about the number of sources. It's about what the quality of those sources are. So you can't see that bottom line. I know, be specific and descriptive, but you can see it on the PowerPoint when you get the PowerPoint. So let's deconstruct a rubric. I gave you the template earlier, but you have the task description. So this is where the student prompt is. Here's your scale, level 1, level 2, level 3. There's your dimension 1, 2, 3. And you might do this reverse, have the scales, well, really the scales across the top is pretty much convention. Dimensions 1, 2, 3. And then each dimension will have a descriptor at level 1, a descriptor at level 2, and a descriptor at level 3. Level 3 being the highest, level 1 being the lowest. In your case, you'll probably have level 4. I suggest that you do about 4 levels, because you'll find that it takes a lot of time to think about the language you're putting in those descriptors. What is important about the 6 facets of understanding that Wiggins and McTighe promote? When you're devising your rubric, look to see how a student can explain something, how they can interpret it, how they can apply it, what perspective they can take about it, the empathy they have in terms of points of view, and self-knowledge with regard to the content that you're teaching. These are all things you can use when you're developing your rubric in terms of language to demonstrate understanding. Do not use the word understanding. Do not use the word recognize. Do not use any of those words that aren't in the 3 higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, or that bird level, that little bird chart we had in A. You've got to keep the language up so that there's evidence of qualitative difference. And these are just ways to support you in writing that kind of language into your descriptors. So there was a math teacher who, in her wisdom, was looking for feedback from her colleagues. Now, this is 7th graders, and she was teaching math, and she had her 4 criteria about what she wanted the students to be able to do to show that they had done it. She gave them an open-ended problem, and then she gave them a page with 2 copies of the rubric, and this is an excellent practice. One of them to fill out when they finished the problem, which is self-evaluation, and one for me to fill out after they turned it in, which is the summative evaluation of the project or this particular lesson or this particular product. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to include students either in the sharing, if not in the creation of the rubrics. So this was her rubric. And again, we have language that's kind of student level friendly, but it isn't emotional to the extent that people are going to feel terrible if they don't make it to WOW. But this is very clearly this teacher is able to determine whether or not the student has achieved what they needed. So she's looking for what problem attack the student was using, the rule of 4. Now this is a quantifiable level, use of skills, and then generalization. And so you see that it's both qualitative and quantitative. These first 2 rows are quantitative, and these last 2 rows are qualitative. So she also used parallel language construction. You can't see it, but if you go down this, you can see that the language is just trouble using skills, uses some skills, uses skills, can identify some skills, can identify skills and uses them correctly. So there's always the key words in the descriptor that follows through each level. No understanding of process, understanding of process. Now I told you not to use the understanding of process, and I stand by that. And she used this. Understands most of the process, but explanation isn't clear. So I would use the word explanation starting down here. Was not able to explain the process. Explain the process in a very limited fashion. Explains the process, most of the process, but it is still unclear. Shows a clear explains the process clearly and is able to generalize to the new situation. Clearly explain the process and generalize to the new rule, process into a rule. So you see that you can change understanding into one of those 6 facets of understanding. Explanation in this case, because she's looking for an explanation. So she says about her rubric, I'm not completely pleased with this rubric because there will be times when there may not be multiple points of entry and so on. The important points of her self-reflection to me were, giving them the rubric was huge. The students realized that everything in class became an opportunity for assessment. As soon as the students got that, they rose to her expectations. And that psychological element of a rubric is unbeatable. That's why we use rubrics. So some of her colleagues gave her some feedback, and one of them said, I think of a rubric as a description of the quality of thinking, and those first 2 columns that were very quantitative were most problematic because it really didn't talk about quality of thinking, it just talked about numbers. And then another person replied, it's good to have multiple methods of representation. I think you're into trouble because you're valuing more different rather than 1 or 2 really in-depth, well thought out strategies, so maybe it wasn't specific enough. This person also said avoid raw counts, which are those first 2 columns. So you really don't want to use those unless it's something that really is important for them to demonstrate. And maybe there's another way to evaluate that. You have to think about how you could evaluate a quantitative piece. And then another said, what does it mean to identify skills? So they're asking for more specificity. So they gave her some very specific feedback on the rubric. And with a question, do they need to write out the name of the standard or simply use it in their work? And how can that be observed? It has to be observable, and you have to be able to hand this to somebody and say, here, you use this. And right now, her rubric really isn't. The first 2 columns, of course, because they're quantitative, but what does that show you about how the student is thinking and how the student is processing the information? And then can identify skills and use them correctly. This is so broad as to almost, you can use it, but you have to make some interpretations, and it may not be consistent across levels. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. So we went over 6 facets of understanding up above, so I'm not going to go back. Well, maybe I'll just reiterate that you want to include these in your rubric. So your task is to design a comprehensive rubric. Let me make this pretty. For each of the GRASP performance tasks that you designed for Module 9, based on the guidance from this presentation and related readings and videos. So please go back through this presentation and read those slides. Criteria technical. The rubric needs to have from 4 to 5 levels of differentiation for scoring unless you and I have a conversation otherwise, and from 4 to 6 different performance dimensions to be scored as appropriate. The content, the rubric must address the goals and objectives of your unit, and specifically the success criteria of the culminating performance task, those bullets that you put for the students to show success. And you will have revised them by this time because you and I will have had that conversation. So with that, I will end this presentation and have fun designing rubrics. It will take a little bit of brain power, so get some protein and get going. Thank you. Have a good week.